It was a crisp autumn afternoon in 2024 when I first drove into Hollow Creek, a remote coastal town that seemed to exist on the edge of reality. I'd just begun my studies at Hollow Creek University, eager to escape my mundane life and immerse myself in a new adventure. I shared my small dorm room with Derek, a childhood friend who had a habit of collecting strange artifacts and old newspapers. After a particularly grueling day of unpacking and sorting through Derek's eclectic collection, I suggested, "Hey, how about we check out the nearby shore? I heard it's beautiful this time of year." Derek, buried under a mountain of dusty books and forgotten trinkets, barely glanced up. "Not today, man. I've got too much to sort through. You go ahead." I had always lived inland, far from any ocean, and the idea of exploring the coast was thrilling. With excitement bubbling inside me, I grabbed my jacket and set out alone, eager to experience the shoreline and its mysterious charm. As I arrived at Hollow Creek Beach, the sight before me was hauntingly beautiful. The setting sun cast a fiery orange glow over the waves. A cool breeze swept through, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay. Seagulls circled above, their cries mingling with the soft murmur of the waves. The contrast of the warm sky and the cooling sea created an almost otherworldly atmosphere. I wandered along the shore, letting my feet sink into the moist sand. I stumbled upon a large, weather-worn rock and decided to sit, taking in the tranquil beauty. As twilight settled, the sky turned into a dark purple canvas dotted with the first stars. The air grew colder and a shiver ran down my spine. I began to prepare to leave. Something strange caught my attention. The shoreline had shifted subtly, and the sea seemed to be encroaching upon the land more aggressively than I had noticed before. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I had misjudged the tide. The water was now up to my knees, and the current felt stronger. Panic set in as I tried to make my way back to the shore. A sudden, powerful wave surged forward, knocking me off balance. I stumbled, feeling a sharp sting in my foot. I looked down to see a deep gash, but the urgency of escaping the rising water pushed aside my concern. I fought against the tide, eventually scrambling out of the water and heading back to my dorm, drenched and shivering. When I burst into our dorm room, Derek looked up from his cluttered desk with a mixture of surprise and concern. "You went to the beach?" he asked, noting my soaked appearance. "You look like you swam in the ocean." Before I could answer, Derek's face turned pale. "There was someone there, behind you. I saw her." My teeth chattered as I tried to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about?" "There was a woman," Derek insisted, voice trembling. "She had long, wet hair and was wearing a yellow dress. She was right behind you, walking through the water." I turned to look behind me, half expecting to see someone. The room was empty, save for the mess of Derek's belongings. "You must be seeing things," I said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Maybe I just caught a cold or something. The next few days were a blur of fever and confusion. I woke up to find my body burning with an intense fever, my muscles aching as if I had been through a strenuous workout. Derek's worry was palpable as he hovered around me, trying to offer comfort and encouragement. By the third day, his concern escalated, and he rushed me to the nearest hospital. The hospital was a cold, sterile place, and I lay in bed, feeling like I was trapped in a fever dream. Derek sat beside me, flipping through channels on the TV. An emergency news report caught our attention. "Authorities have discovered the body of a young woman who drowned at Hollow Creek Beach," the anchor's voice crackled through the speakers. "She was found nearly a week after her disappearance. Her clothing was described as yellow, and she had long hair." Derek's eyes widened, and he turned to me with a look of horror. "That's her," he whispered, "the woman I saw." My heart pounded as I tried to piece together the horrifying connection. The location where the woman's body was found was eerily close to where I had been struggling against the tide. The realization that I might have had a close encounter with a ghostly presence left me feeling chilled to the bone. Despite my worsening condition, the doctors couldn't explain the nature of my illness. The fever persisted, and my health seemed to deteriorate with each passing day. By the fourth day, fever began to subside, and my physical condition improved, but the eerie sensation of the ghostly woman lingered. As the years passed, I graduated and left Hollow Creek, but the memory of that fateful night never fully left me. Each visit back to the town brought a mix of nostalgia and dread. The beach remained a place of bittersweet beauty, a reminder of the ocean's allure and its hidden dangers. The whispering waves and the distant cries of seagulls became a haunting refrain. I would walk along the shore, hoping to find solace, but instead finding the ghostly presence of the woman with the yellow dress lingering in the back of my mind. Hollow Creek Beach was more than a picturesque spot. It was a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was unsettlingly thin. The ocean, with its inviting appearance, hid secrets beneath its surface, secrets that once almost claimed me. Years later, I returned to Hollow Creek for a reunion with old friends. As I walked along the beach, now familiar yet still unnerving, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The air was colder and the tide was higher than usual. My thoughts drifted back to that night, and the whispers of the waves seemed to carry a message from the past. I stopped at the same boulder where I had sat years ago and gazed out at the darkening sea. The waves whispered and roared, and for a moment, I felt the presence of something beyond the veil of reality. The ghostly woman's story had become a part of me. A reminder that the ocean's allure came with hidden dangers and untold mysteries. As I turned to leave, I noticed something in the sand. An old, yellow dress, partially buried. The faded, hauntingly familiar pattern. The realization hit me with a jolt. Some stories never truly end. They simply wait for the next chapter to begin. The shore, with its whispering tides, would always hold a piece of my past. A place where the boundaries between life and death were disturbingly close, and where the silent tide of fate had once nearly claimed me. It was the autumn of 2019 when Ken and his colleague Mike embarked on a routine business trip to the sleepy outskirts of a small town in New England. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning shades of amber and crimson, and the roads were lined with towering, ancient trees that seemed to swallow the light. Their work was mundane, a series of meetings and inspections that left them both yearning for something more. Something to break the monotony of their lives. As the day drew to a close and they started their journey back home, the sky darkened earlier than usual. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world in a blanket of inky darkness. They drove along Route 19, a long stretch of road that wound through dense forests and isolated farmlands. It was a road that locals rarely used after sunset, a road with a history of strange occurrences and whispered rumors. Mike, a man of science and logic, broke the silence. "You know, they say this road is haunted," said with a smirk, glancing at Ken from the passenger seat. "People talk about a woman, ghost, who appears at night. They say she's a spirit who died in a car accident years ago." Ken chuckled, keeping his eyes on the road. "Come on, Mike. You don't actually believe in that stuff, do you? It's just a bunch of stories to scare the kids." Mike shrugged. "I don't know, man. We've been driving for hours, and this road is starting to get to me. It's dark, and it feels different, you know? Like something's watching us." Ken shook his head, dismissing his friend's unease. "Relax. We'll be home soon. Besides, we drove through here this morning, and nothing happened." But as the miles stretched on, the road grew darker, the trees on either side closing in like the jaws of some great beast. The headlights of their car barely pierced the thick, oppressive blackness. Silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, Ken slowed the car, his heart skipping a beat as he noticed something in the distance. A figure was walking slowly in the middle of the road. A woman. She was dressed in a short skirt and a blazer, like she was heading to or from work. Her steps were measured, almost deliberate, and she seemed oblivious to the car approaching. Is she crazy? Walking in the middle of the road at this time of night? Ken muttered, grip on the steering wheel tightening. Mike leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. Maybe she needs a ride. Pull over, let's see if she's okay. Ken nodded and honked the horn to get her attention, but she didn't react. Car crept closer, and still she showed no signs of acknowledging them. Mike rolled down his window and called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" The woman didn't answer. She didn't even turn her head. There was something unsettling about her, something that made Ken's skin crawl. Mike leaned further out the window, trying to get a better look at her face. "Hey miss, are you okay?" It was then that he saw her face clearly, illuminated by the car's headlights. His breath caught in his throat, and his face drained of color. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes were black pits, and blood was seeping from her empty eye sockets and mouth. It was a grotesque, horrifying sight that made his blood run cold. "Jesus Christ!" Mike screamed, recoiling in terror. His voice trembled, and his whole body stiffened with fear. "Ken, drive! Drive now!" Ken, still unaware of what Mike had seen, asked, "What's wrong? What did you see?" "Oh, Ken, it's a ghost. She's a ghost," Mike shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He was almost incoherent, his words slurred with terror. "She's right behind us. She's chasing us." Ken's heart raced as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman was no longer in front of the car. She was now standing behind it, her lifeless eyes fixed on them. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and blood continued to pour from her empty socket. Ken slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped down the road. Mike was shaking uncontrollably, his eyes wide with fear. "She's real, Ken. She's real, and she's coming after us." Ken's mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination, something that wasn't real. But Mike's terror was palpable, infectious, and soon Ken found himself gripped by the same fear. As they rounded a bend in the road, Ken caught sight of the woman again. This time, she was standing directly in their path, her arms outstretched as if she was trying to stop the car. There was no time to react. Ken swerved to avoid her, but it was too late. The car clipped her, and there was a sickening thud as she was thrown into the air. Ken's hands shook as he tried to regain control of the car, but it was no use. The car careened off the road, slamming into a power pole with a deafening crash. The force of the impact shattered the windshield, and the car's front end crumpled like paper. Everything went silent. The world outside was dark and still. The only sound, the soft ticking of the engine cooling down. Ken's head was spinning, his ears ringing from the crash. He turned to Mike, who was slumped in his seat, blood trickling down his forehead. "Mike, are you okay?" Ken's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Mike didn't respond. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, staring blankly ahead. Ken's heart sank as he realized his friend was dead. Before he could fully comprehend what had happened, he saw her again. The woman. She was standing just outside the car, her face pressed against the shattered window. Her black eyes bore into his soul, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Blood dripped from her face, pooling on the ground beneath her. Ken's breath hitched as the woman's hand reached through the broken window, her cold, clammy fingers brushing against his skin. He recoiled, trying to push her away, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed with fear. "Why?" The word escaped his lips in a trembling whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she opened her mouth wider, and a long, bloodied tongue slithered out, reaching for him. Ken's eyes widened in horror as the tongue wrapped around his neck, tightening like a noose. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as darkness closed in around him. And then, everything went black. The sound of distant sirens echoed in the night, stark contrast to the eerie silence that had fallen over the scene of the accident. Emergency lights flashed red and blue, casting an otherworldly glow on the twisted wreckage of Ken's car. The once peaceful road was now a chaotic mess of shattered glass, splintered metal, and bloodstains. Paramedics rushed to the scene, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. The first responder, a seasoned EMT named Sarah, approached the car cautiously. She had seen her fair share of accidents. Something about this one felt different. There was an unsettling chill in the air, a sense of dread that hung heavy over the scene. As she peered into the car, her breath caught in her throat. The driver, Ken, was slumped over the steering wheel, his face pale and lifeless. But it was the passenger seat that made her blood run cold. Mike's body was twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open, frozen in a final expression of sheer terror. What the hell happened here? Sarah muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. She motioned for her partner to help her extract the bodies from the car. As they worked, the police arrived, led by Detective James Miller, a grizzled veteran with a reputation for solving even the most baffling cases. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, taking in every detail. Skid marks on the road, broken power pole, the position of the car, it all told a story. But it was a story that didn't make sense. "Looks like they lost control and crashed into the pole," one of the officers said, shaking his head. "But the speed they were going, they should have survived." Miller frowned, kneeling beside the car. He noticed the blood smeared on the inside of the windshield, the shattered glass, and something else. Long strands of dark hair tangled in the wreckage. He pulled on a pair of gloves and carefully retrieved a piece of the hair, examining it closely. "This doesn't belong to either of them," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Something's not right here." As they continued their investigation, a tow truck arrived to haul the wreckage away. The driver, a burly man with a weathered face, hooked up the car and began the slow process of lifting it onto the flatbed. But as the car was raised, something fell from underneath it, landing with a soft thud on the pavement. Miller approached the object cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The object lay motionless on the cold pavement, partially obscured by the shadows cast by the flickering lights. As he drew closer, the beam of his flashlight revealed what had fallen, a large, blood-stained cloth. But there was something odd about it. It wasn't just a piece of fabric. It was wrapped around something solid. Detective Miller carefully knelt down and began to unwrap the cloth, his gloved hands trembling slightly. With each layer he peeled back, a sense of dread grew within him, tightening like a vice around his heart. When he finally uncovered what lay inside, he recoiled, curse escaping his lips. It was a severed human hand, the skin pale and lifeless, the fingers curled as if they had tried to grasp something in their final moments. The hand was mangled as though it had been caught in some terrible machinery, the bones visible through the torn flesh. But what chilled Miller to the bone was the small gold ring still clinging to one of the fingers, delicate band with a single, tiny diamond. It looked eerily out of place on the mutilated hand. "Get the coroner here now," Miller barked, his voice sharp with urgency. One of the officers, already pale from the sight, nodded and hurried to call it in. As Miller stood, trying to make sense of this gruesome discovery, his thoughts were interrupted by the faintest sound, a soft, wet dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. He whipped around, his flashlight scanning the area, but there was nothing there. The road was empty, the only movement the swaying of the trees in the breeze. He was about to dismiss it as his imagination when the sound came again, this time closer, more distinct. It was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakably human. The words were slurred, incoherent, but they sent a shiver down Miller's spine. "Help me." Miller's blood ran cold as he realized the voice was coming from under the car. He motioned for the tow truck driver to stop, and then, with cautious steps, approached the underside of the vehicle. He knelt down, his flashlight flickering as it struggled to penetrate the darkness beneath the car. "Who's there?" Miller called out, his voice firm but laced with unease. The only response was another whisper, this one more urgent, more desperate. "Please help." Miller hesitated for only a moment before he lay down on the ground, ignoring the damp cold seeping into his clothes. He edged his way under the car, the flashlight beam leading the way. As he crawled deeper, the smell hit him. Rotting flesh, decay, and something else. Something that smelled faintly of sulfur. His heart pounded in his chest as he finally saw the source of the voice. There, wedged between the undercarriage and the road, was a woman. But this was no ordinary woman. Her body was twisted in impossible angles, her limbs broken and contorted as though she had been crushed by some unimaginable force. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those hollow black eyes, stared at him with a mixture of agony and fury. Miller's breath caught in his throat. It was the woman from the crash, the same one Mike had described in his final frantic moments. She was real, and yet, she shouldn't have been. "Help me," the woman rasped again, her voice a haunting echo that seemed to reverberate through the very marrow of Miller's bones. He scrambled back, fear clawing at his mind. This was impossible. There was no way she could still be alive. Not in this state. He had seen countless bodies in his career, but nothing like this, nothing that defied all logic and reason. As he backed away, the woman's hand, still clutching the gold ring, reached out toward him. Her fingers were broken, the nails torn and bloody, but she was still trying to grasp him, pull him closer. "Please," she whispered, her voice now filled with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. "Help me." Miller felt a sudden surge of pity, mixed with the paralyzing fear that had gripped him. He didn't know what to do. Everything in him screamed to run, to get away from this nightmare. Something held him there, rooted to the spot. Before he could make a decision, the tow truck driver spoke, snapping him back to reality. "Detective, is everything okay?" Miller blinked, the spell broken, turned his head, momentarily losing sight of the woman. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just give me a minute." But when he turned back to the spot where the woman had been, she was gone. The space beneath the car was empty, save for a few smears of blood on the road. The hand, the whispers, the woman, it had all vanished as if it had never been there. Miller scrambled out from under the car, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He stood up, his legs shaking as he tried to steady himself. The other officers were looking at him with concern, but he waved them off. There's nothing under there," he lied, his mind racing. "Just get the car out of here." As the tow truck pulled the wreckage away, Miller stood alone on the side of the road, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He tried to rationalize what had happened, tried to convince himself that it had been some sort of hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue. But deep down, he knew that what he had seen was real, and it terrified him. The days following the accident were filled with unanswered questions and mounting unease. The coroner's report on Mike's body was inconclusive. While the cause of death was listed as trauma from the crash, there were unusual injuries that couldn't be easily explained. Deep lacerations that didn't match the wreckage, and bruises that seemed to form patterns across his skin. Patterns that looked eerily like handprints. As for Ken, the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing. His lungs were filled with blood, but there were no external injuries to suggest how it got there. Coroner, an experienced pathologist, could only describe it as a spontaneous hemorrhage, something he'd never seen before in someone with no prior health issues. Detective Miller buried himself in the investigation, trying to piece together what had happened on Route 19. He interviewed anyone who might have information: the locals, families of the deceased, even the few people who still lived near that cursed road. But all he got were more rumors, more ghost stories about the woman who haunted the stretch of highway. The stories were all eerily similar. A woman dressed in business attire who would appear out of nowhere, always at night. She would wander the road, her face hidden in shadow, and those unfortunate enough to encounter her would meet with a tragic fate. Some said she was the spirit of a woman who had died in a car accident years ago, her body never found, her soul trapped in eternal torment. Others believed she was something older, something more sinister, a malevolent entity that fed on fear and despair. Miller wasn't one to believe in ghosts, but after what he had seen, he couldn't dismiss the possibility. The evidence, or lack thereof, was gnawing at him. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange occurrences that couldn't be explained by logic alone. He started digging deeper, searching through old records and news archives. It was a slow, painstaking process, but eventually he found something. A newspaper clipping from 1985 detailing a fatal car crash on Route 19. The victim was a young woman, Sarah Thompson, who had been driving home late one night when she lost control of her car and collided with a power pole. The same power pole that Ken and Mike had crashed into. According to the article, Sarah's body was never recovered. The car was found mangled beyond recognition, but there was no trace of the driver. The only thing they found was her purse, lying in the grass beside the road, and a single gold ring that had been flung from the wreckage. Miller's heart raced as he read the article. This was it. This was the connection he had been looking for. But as he continued to read, his excitement turned to dread. The article mentioned that Sarah had been engaged to be married, the wedding set to take place just a week after the accident. Fiancé, devastated by her death, had taken his own life not long after. The two were said to be inseparable, soulmates bound together by love, and now, it seemed, by death. Miller leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's spirit was still out there, trapped on that road, reliving the moment of her death over and over again. And anyone who crossed her path was doomed to suffer the same fate. But why now? Why had she suddenly become so violent, so vengeful? Had something triggered her? Or was it just the passage of time, the decades of lingering unrest that had twisted her spirit into something dark and dangerous? Miller knew he had to find out. Couldn't let this continue. Couldn't let more innocent lives be lost to the haunting of Route 19. He decided to return to the scene of the accident, to confront whatever it was that haunted that road. The night was thick with fog as Miller drove back to Route 19, the headlights of his car barely cutting through the dense mist. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears as he approached the site where the accidents had taken place. The road seemed even darker, the trees more oppressive, as though the very landscape was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. He parked his car on the side of the road, just a few yards from where Ken's vehicle crashed. The night was deathly quiet, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He stepped out, his flashlight in hand, and started walking down the road. Every step felt like a journey deeper into the unknown, each footfall heavy with the weight of impending doom. Miller's senses were on high alert, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, his ears straining to catch even the faintest whisper of sound. As he walked, he began to notice something strange. The fog was thickening, swirling around him like a living thing, and with it came a chill that seeped into his bones. It was as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant, the warmth of the summer night replaced by a cold, unnatural presence. Then he saw her. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure standing in the middle of the road, barely visible through the fog. But as he drew closer, the details became clearer. The woman was standing with her back to him, dressed in the same short skirt and blazer that Mike had described. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back in tangled waves. She stood perfectly still, her posture unnaturally rigid, as though she were waiting for something, or someone. Miller's breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening around the flashlight. He knew it was her, Sarah Thompson, the ghost that had haunted this road for decades. But now she was real, standing right in front of him. "Sarah?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Sarah Thompson?" The woman didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there as though she hadn't heard him. Miller took a step closer, his heart pounding. "Sarah, I know what happened to you. I know you died here on this road. But it's over now. You don't have to stay here anymore." Still, the woman didn't move, but something in the air shifted, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of Miller's neck stand on end. "Please, Sarah," he pleaded, taking another step forward. "Let go. It's time to rest." For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and suffocating. And then slowly the woman began to turn. Miller's breath hitched as she faced him. Her face was as he had seen it before, pale, lifeless, with those hollow black eyes that seemed to stare right through him. Blood trickled from her eyes and mouth, a grotesque mockery of tears, and her expression was one of sorrow mixed with fury. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo that reverberated through the fog. Miller took a step back, his heart racing. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. You can move on. There's nothing holding you here anymore." But the woman shook her head slowly, her black eyes never leaving his. "You can't leave." And then, before Miller could react, she lunged at him. Her hands, cold and clammy, wrapped around his throat, her grip impossibly strong. He gasped for air, his vision blurring as she squeezed tighter, her face inches from his, those black eyes filled with hatred and despair. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice now a desperate plea, as though she were caught between her desire for vengeance and her need for release. Miller struggled, his hands clawing at hers, but it was no use. The coldness seeped into his skin, his strength waning as the world around him darkened. He was on the brink of unconsciousness when, in a final desperate attempt, he reached out with his other hand and touched the ring on her finger. For a split second, everything stopped. The woman froze, her grip loosening, her black eyes widening in shock. And then, as though a switch had been flipped, she released him, stumbling back with a strangled cry. Miller collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his vision swimming as he looked up at her. The woman was staring at the ring on her finger, her expression one of confusion and pain. For the first time, Miller saw something in her eyes other than rage, something human. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice weak. She looked at him, her black eyes softening, the blood on her face beginning to fade. "I wasn't ready," she murmured, her voice now filled with sorrow. And then she was gone. Fog began to lift, the oppressive chill in the air dissipating as if it had never been there. The road was empty once more, the only sound the distant hum of crickets in the night. Miller sat there for a long time, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He had confronted the ghost of Sarah Thompson, and somehow he had helped her find peace. But at what cost? And would it truly be the end of the haunting? As he finally stood and made his way back to his car, couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt lighter, the darkness less menacing. Perhaps, he thought, Sarah had finally found the rest she deserved. But as he drove away from Route 19, his thoughts still racing, couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. And for a brief moment, just before the road disappeared from view, he thought he saw her standing there, watching him with those sad black eyes. When he blinked, she was gone, leaving only the dark, empty road behind. In the weeks that followed, Route 19 returned to its usual quiet state. The accident stopped, the rumors of the ghostly woman faded, and life in the small town resumed its normal rhythm. But for Detective James Miller, things would never be the same. Couldn't forget what he had seen, what he had experienced on that haunted stretch of road. The image of Sarah Thompson, her twisted form, her black eyes, haunted his dreams, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the ordinary world. He knew that the case was closed, but there was nothing more to investigate. But deep down, also knew that the haunting of Route 19 was just one of many mysteries that defied explanation, and that somewhere, out there in the darkness, other restless spirits waited for their stories to be told. As Miller continued his work, solving cases, uncovering truths, he couldn't help but wonder how many of those truths lay hidden in the shadows, beyond the reach of logic and reason. And how many more would he encounter before his own journey came to an end? Only time would tell. And as for Route 19, it remained just as it had always been. Quiet, unassuming road winding through the New England countryside. But for those who knew its history, it would forever be a place of fear, of tragedy, and of restless spirits who could not find peace. And for Detective James Miller, it was a reminder that sometimes past refuses to stay buried.